Thank you all for joining today's panel discussion on the state of education in numbers. I'm Maria Conchan, Dean at the McCourt School of Public Policy, and I'm delighted to be here to set the virtual stage for our discussion. First, I would like to extend a warm welcome to our guests, former Microsoft CEO and founder of USAFacts, Steve Ballmer, USAFacts data analyst, Olivia Martin, and McCourt School professor and economist, Nora Gordon. I'd also like to thank our event partners, the McCourt School Massive Data Institute and USAFacts. In today's conversation, you will hear an overview of the state of education in numbers from USAFacts' recent report, followed by a panel discussion on the report's key themes and how data can inform education policy and policy more broadly in the United States. This past year, the pandemic disrupted many areas of life and challenged industries, sectors, and systems, including the education system. As policymakers, researchers, and communities work to understand both the short and long-term impacts, data science will play a critical role in guiding evidence-based decision-making and our recovery efforts. At this time of significant change and in an environment with increasing challenges of misinformation and heightened political tension, the need for evidence-based policy solutions and ethically grounded change makers is more urgent than ever. At the McCourt School, partnering with communities, organizations, and experts to improve policymaking through collaboration, data, and evidence is at the heart of our work, which is why we're so pleased to be having this timely discussion. With that said, it is my pleasure to introduce Fadal Moore, who will share more about our panelists. Fadal is a second-year MPP student from Washington, D.C. by way of Atlanta, Georgia. As the son of a public school teacher, he cultivated a passion to fight for quality education to truly be a right and not a privilege. After graduating from Harvard University with a degree in government, Fadal became a middle school social studies teacher, where he taught students history as well as how to affect change in their communities. In 2019, we were very pleased when he joined the McCourt School community as a McCourt Scholar. As a student, Fadal continues his work in education as a member of DC's Social Studies Standards Advisory Committee, which is tasked with creating guidelines to create more anti-racist social studies standards, and through work on his thesis, which analyzes the relationship between state civic course requirements and youth who go on to vote for presidential elections. So welcome, Fadal.
Thank you, Dean Conchan. Good afternoon, everyone. Once again, my name is Fadal Moore. I'm a Master's of Public Policy candidate here at the McCourt School. Former teacher, very, very passionate about education reform and what that looks like for low-income communities and Black communities. So I'm very fascinated by this conversation and very eager to jump into it. It's my pleasure to introduce tonight's speakers, beginning with the former Microsoft CEO and founder of USAFacts, Steve Ballmer. Steve Ballmer became Microsoft CEO in 2000, having served for 20 years in roles as President, Senior Vice President of Sales and Support, Senior Vice President of System Software, and Vice President of Marketing. He was the company's first business manager, and during his tenure at Microsoft, the company pioneered personal computing and democratized enterprise computing, growing from a small startup to a company. By his retirement in 2014, the company grew to almost $80 billion in revenue and was the third most profitable company in the United States. In 2017, Steve launched USAFacts, a nonpartisan nonprofit that aims to help people ground policy debates in a comprehensive and unbiased set of facts by making government data more accessible and understandable. Along with his wife, Connie, Steve also serves as co-founder of Ballmer Group, which supports efforts to improve economic mobility for children and families in the United States who are disproportionately likely to remain in poverty. Steve is also chairman of the Los Angeles Clippers basketball team. Next, I'd like to introduce Olivia Martin and Nora Gordon, who will be joining tonight's panel discussion moderated by Dean Maria Conchan. Olivia Martin is a research manager at USAFacts, driving the organization's research and analysis. She was the primary researcher for reports such as the State of the Union in Numbers, the State of the Earth, and the USAFacts Annual Report for Government. Olivia is a graduate of Stanford University with a BA in economics with honors and distinction. She served as the chair of Stanford and Government, worked as a research assistant at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research, and started her career at USAFacts as an intern. Olivia is passionate about evidence-based policymaking and improving the availability of comprehensive government data to ground debate and conversation in the United States. Nora Gordon is an economist and associate professor at the McCourt School of Public Policy. Her research focuses on American education policy with an emphasis on the federal role in elementary and secondary education. She has studied the distributional impacts of Title I, fiscal rules governing federal education grants, the community eligibility provision, state school finance reforms, causes and consequences of school desegregation, and school district consolidation. She is a research associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research, non-resident fellow of the Urban Institute, a member of the Future Ed Advisory Board, and serves in the Professional Advisory Board of the National Center for Learning Disabilities. In 2020, Dr. Gordon co-authored a book with Carrie Conaway titled Common Sense Evidence, the Education Leader's Guide to Using Data and Research, published by Harvard Education Press. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Education Week, and The Atlantic, in addition to academic journals. Lastly, I'd like to share more about tonight's moderator, Dean Maria Canchin. In addition to leading the McCourt School, Dean Canchin facilitates research that examines the dynamic between public policies and family well-being, both how policies shape choices and outcomes for families, and how family change creates new challenges and opportunities for public policy. Her ongoing projects analyze the interactions of incarceration, child welfare, and child support systems, as well as the implications of multi-partner fertility for family organization and policy. She has advised local, state, and federal agencies on policy initiatives designed to improve outcomes, especially for low-income and otherwise vulnerable families. Prior to joining Georgetown University, Dean Canchin was a Kellett Professor and served as Associate Dean for Social Sciences and Fiscal Initiatives and as Director of the Institute for Research on Poverty at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She also served as Senior Advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Health and Human Services and Deputy Assistant Secretary for Policy for the HHS Administration for Children and Families in the Obama administration. With that, I'm excited to turn things over to Steve Ballmer to share an overview of the state of education in numbers from USAFacts' latest report.
Thanks a lot, Fadal. Really appreciate it. Appreciate the opportunity to all at McCourt School to come on, and really appreciate the opportunity from the students to just chat a little bit about some topics that are really important to me. USAFacts, as Fadal said, is you can best, if you want to think about it this way, you can think about it as a website, usafacts.org, but it's a service that we started 5 or 6 years ago. Why? I retired from Microsoft in 2014, and my wife, who'd been really running our philanthropy, focused in on issues of child welfare, primarily in the state of Washington. She said, "Okay, dude, it's time. You gotta get in here and help me with the philanthropy." I was kind of tired. I said, no. All we really need to do is pay our taxes. It's really government who does the work of supporting kids who are less fortunate. And she said, we can do better than that. So I said, all right, I'm in. But it's kind of one of those things that sometimes happens, at least between husbands and wives, where I felt compelled nonetheless to prove I was right and that government played the role I had said. So I wanted to dive in and really study government by the numbers. I'm a numbers person. I don't turn first to forecasts and analysis. I just kind of want to know what's happened. What do the numbers say? Has there been wealth transfer from the more affluent to the less affluent? Has there been support of kids in need? What does that really look like? First thing I started to do was to get online, search all around, and man, you can find a lot of links. And every link's got a point of view or it's got some specific data. And I said, how do we go high level? Where's the high level summary that tells me who's paying taxes? What is the money getting spent on? Who's being supported? And at the end of the day, are there good outcomes? The government doesn't exist to make a profit. It exists to support less fortunate people, defend the country, do education, a variety of other things. I could not find anything that really helped me. As a business person, if I was analyzing a competitor, the first thing I would have done is turn to what's called a 10K report that the Securities and Exchange Commission makes every public company file. And those things don't have forecasts. They just talk about the past. It's just, I'll say just the facts. But what that really means is just the numbers. Adjectives can be partisan, they can be biased. Numbers don't have that property. You could say X is huge and Y is small, but unless you tell me this is the number of X, this is the number of Y, how do they fit into the overall spending that's going on, I don't think those adjectives are all that helpful. So I was looking for this 10K kind of report. Numbers, the 10K, government makes you be comprehensive about your whole business. You've got to put things in the context of history and other businesses. Just the facts. If you try to pump up your business in a 10K report, the Securities and Exchange Commission will give you a big no-no, all the way to the point of a fine. So I started looking for a 10K report about government in the United States. And guess what? Couldn't find anything like it. I said, I'm going to build one of these. I'm curious what this would look like. And so I started with just one guy a few years back, and we were chugging along, and we were really doing this just for me, basically, when we got started. I was teaching a class at the business school in Stanford. They gave me a research assistant. I was teaching with an economist. At the end of the day, we were able to create such a thing. We said, well, look, if it's interesting to us, maybe it'll be interesting to others. 10Ks are pretty detailed. So we said, maybe we should also write the corporate equivalent of an annual report. Now that was interesting because that was readable. That was a narrative about in any given year, what does the government look like by the numbers? And actually harkens back to the Constitution. The Constitution literally calls for a State of the Union address to be made by the president every year to educate the population. It was an idea our founders understood. In fact, Madison said a popular government without popular information or the means of acquiring it is but a prologue to a farce or a tragedy, or perhaps both. So we were saying, look, let's do our State of the Union by the numbers. No adjectives, just what's going on, and that's what we've done. We followed the principles. We only use government numbers, just as a 10K report would only use the numbers of the business. We don't use forecasts unless they're somehow official from the Congressional Budget Office. I love academics. We'll use no academic research. With respect to the academics, for any academic who says X, there's another academic who says not X. And so we said, let's just stick to what really has happened. And let's not do what politicians do either. What do politicians do? They pick one number out of the air that makes their point, and they don't give you enough context. That's the thing we've gone through. We expanded it now. We provide other data along the way. We write articles, but we stay grounded. We express no opinions about what should happen. We try to put data together in interesting ways so people can see data that's related to a problem, and we move forward. Education, which we'll talk about today, is a very good example because education matters a lot to my wife and I as we think about economic mobility in the United States. It's a big deal. And maybe we could have the first slide, please. As you think about education by the numbers, the first thing, I'll just give us some context. Education is about a $700 billion, K through 12 education is about $700 billion in the United States out of a total government spend, state, local, and federal. Unless you put all three together, you can't really see what's being spent on education. We talked about federal money that goes through into K-12, but then there's mostly state and local money. So you really need to look at the amalgam of all of those, which is what we do in our practice at USAFacts. You put that all together, 700 billion of 6 trillion spent by government. Very interesting. If you back up though and you say, okay, if we can't get kids ready for kindergarten, they come in way behind. So what does the world look like in terms of preschool attendance? Are we getting our kids ready? Very important to my wife and I. Now, if you really try to understand who's in preschool in the United States, if you try to understand that by geography, by race, by economic background, it is still very hard. We have not done a perfect job on this, I will tell you. On USAFacts, my wife and I have been interested in advocating for broader preschool access for poor kids in our home state of Washington, in Los Angeles County, where we own our basketball team, in Detroit, which is my hometown. And enough data just doesn't exist. We know in aggregate, 76% of kids in Washington, D.C., which actually has the highest preschool attendance of any place in the country. That's great. North Dakota is the lowest at, I can't remember, 26%. But this is insufficient to help us tune our thinking about where to be active. This includes kids whose parents can pay full freight, kids who can't, kids who go half day, kids who go full day, 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. And then in point of fact, the research from the psychologists tell us things are different, whether you're 3, whether you're 4, whether you're poor, whether you're rich. How do we frame that question? So we dive in maybe to a step further, next slide, and take a look, for example, at the federal funding for Head Start. Head Start is a program for preschool funded by the federal government. That's a $10 billion program. Now, some people say, oh, 10 billion, that's a lot of money. Well, it is and it isn't. When you talk about the government spend, state, federal, and local, again, is about 6 trillion. This is before the additional 6 trillion in stimulus. So let's keep that out of our thought process because that's short term. Well, 10 billion is a lot, but compared to the number of kids in need, Head Start only reaches about 1 out of 10 kids who are in the bottom 40% of income earners. About 1 out of 10. And actually, it's a little higher than that. It's a little bit higher. I misdid my math. It's closer to 2.5 or 3 out of 10. Okay. Is 10 billion a lot? Well, I don't know, because we have to look at what states spend. If you try to dive into what states spend, it is very complicated. What should we think about as citizens? What is state? What is local? Again, I'm just a citizen who cares about the topic. We all are. Whether it's because we're going to vote, whether it's because we're going to write to our legislators, whether it's because we want to get involved in the industry or being active and advocating, we need to know these kinds of things. We can't just say, oh, we need a bunch more money. No, we have to really know what are the problems, what's the money for. I will wear one piece of bias. I am not a guy who thinks we can spend infinite amount of money from government perspective. I care about things like deficits. I almost prefer state local budgets, which need to balance, but that's for another time. Okay, a lot of unknown questions, but some good data. Let's turn to K through 12. In K through 12, we have a lot more data about what's going on. Maybe still not sufficient. We have an expert on Title I on the call, Nora, and I'll tell you, if you're just an average citizen trying to understand Title I dollars in some simple, comprehensible way, very tough. The one thing we do know is 2/3 of 8th graders are not proficient in math and reading. 2/3 are not proficient. We know those numbers go higher, 75%. For African Americans and Latinxes. So this is an area in which one can really argue we are not getting great outcomes. At least I don't think so. This is, again, people can judge. We don't tell you what is good and what is bad in general. We try to let people make their own decisions about what's good and what's bad. In this case, I think most citizens would agree reading and math proficiency is a pretty big deal. But then how do we improve this situation? Well, maybe we should look at class size. If you look at class size has declined dramatically since the 50s and 60s. Student-teacher ratios. Student-teacher ratios have gone from about 27 students per teacher down to about 16 students per teacher. Much, much improved. And yet our academic performance has only marginally improved, as you can see these numbers. Do we need to spend more money? If we're going to spend more money, is it further shrinking class size? Should we pay teachers more, which would certainly be the push for the very powerful teachers unions? Is that the right thing to do? If we're going to spend more money, should we put the money into after-school programs and things that provide additional supports, particularly for the least affluent people in our society? Without good numbers on what's going on, and not just some aggregate gross number for the country, we're not going to be able to make these decisions really well. Next slide. Oh, one other thing. Graduation rates. Graduation rates, I'm pleased to report, are up from about 71% to 85%. But is it easy to find the graduation requirements? Have they gotten easier or harder? That should be published. I do know in California that if you have a D average and you have taken a certain set of courses, you will pass. You will graduate from high school. So I don't know how much stock to put in graduation rates, again, unless we get the data. Next slide. Everybody, I think, has a sense that things are worse in education because of the pandemic. We don't have a lot of real-time data. It's one of the things that bothers me about government. There are no systems for real-time data. In business, you'd want real-time data so you can make real-time adjustments. The thing we absolutely know is there are plenty of kids who don't have adequate computer access and internet access at home. But if you really dig into this and you say, what is the problem in the digital divide? How do we go after it? People generally think about rural areas. But if you analyze urban areas, it turns out people will say there's internet in your area as long as one home or one apartment in the area is served by an internet connection. That doesn't tell us anything. We need objective data about how things sit today, at least in my view, before we pontificate about where to go and what to do, how to get there. Let's talk a little bit about college. Everybody here pretty much, I think, on the call is either in college or has gone to college. So let's talk a little bit about college. You can ask, is college a good value? What does it cost to go to college, and what is the benefit of going to college? And I'll do that in terms of economics. There may be other benefits. The good news is a college graduate makes about 67% more on average than a high school graduate. Now, that's an average. Median and mean is important in this game. We have to be statistical. We'd want to talk about that in greater detail. The cost of education, you can kind of see it here. This is inflation adjusted. The cost of education has gone up much faster than inflation. Much, much faster than inflation. Now, those were adjectives. Off the top of my head, I think those numbers have gone up about 29% since the early 90s, but the numbers are contained on this chart. The thing that people miss is financial aid has also gone up. That doesn't mean there's not a gap. People will say, if you look at the numbers, by the numbers in public schools, average tuition, room and board is about $22,000 a year. The thing people fail to mention is the real cost is much less because the average grant aid is almost half the average tuition. And if you're really going to do things by the numbers, what you want to do is take tuition minus tuition, room and board minus grant, because that's the thing that's going to cause you to build up loans and other needs to work while you're in college. You know, I look at this and I say, whoa, this is expensive. Should we cut college back and try to do college in 3 years? I'm sure there's a lot of shaking you'd find in educational institutions, but it's a thing I think about. This is about four-year institutions. We have a lot of attendance with less completion in community colleges. And yet, if you look, as my wife and I do at Economic Mobility, some of the best path to higher paying jobs are through community college. You get a certification as a high-tech welder, for example, which you can get at community college. You can make $70,000, $80,000 a year, which is well above median wage, twice median wage, which is about $38,000 in the United States. Let's go last topic, which then is debt, particularly as you look at emerging from school with debt, and particularly with the discussion of should debt be forgiven, college debt or student loans. While I have an opinion on that, everybody's entitled to their opinion. It is certainly true, and you can see it here in the number, in the line in pink, student debt has risen a lot. We're up to almost 1.6 trillion in student debt. That's higher than credit card debt, auto debt. It's not as much as mortgage debt, but 1.6 trillion. Now, is that a lot of money? Now you can decide. People graduate with, on average, about $34,000 of debt when they get out of college. Is $34,000, is that a lot of money or not? Well, you have to compare that to the improved earnings that you have. You have to ask the question I asked earlier. Can we re-engineer down the cost of college? If we were to forgive all of this student debt, 1.6 trillion, that sounds like a very large number. To me, it still sounds like a large number, but given that we've already committed 6 trillion to stimulus, you could say, 1.6 trillion, let's get rid of it. On the other hand, then I would say, is that fair or not to people who are now building debt? Does that mean we have to essentially subsidize students in college forever? What's the principle? What does that cost? How will that affect the federal deficit? The federal deficit was about $1 trillion a year prior to the stimulus, and the government, federal government, was spending about $4 trillion on $3 trillion of tax revenue, and we just added $6 trillion more of spending on top of that, albeit one-time spending. So you take all of this context around education, and you can say, do we like where we are or not? Are we willing to spend more money or not? Do we have ideas? Do we have enough tools to understand where and how to spend that data, let alone evidence-based practice on the things that are most likely to work? And I remain, now I speak from our philanthropic standpoint. That's my timer. I'm just about done. From the standpoint of our philanthropy, I think there is more to be done. I think we have to decide how we target that against less affluent kids, kids of color. How do we really make progress? And how do we re-engineer things that maybe cost too much today? Because part of the way we'll get there is by not only allocating new money, but reallocating old money. So with that, I'm going to stop. I appreciate the chance to talk to you before we get into our panel and Q&A. My pleasure, and back to you, Maria.
Well, thanks so much, Steve. I like your ending with a challenge that we can make things better, and we have to figure out how to get there, and the data is a big part of getting there. I'll wait to have an argument with you about whether academics have anything to add to this in another
context.
I didn't
say they had nothing to add.
No, that's fine, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But I'm delighted to moderate tonight's panel. And before we get started, I just want to remind the audience that we'll be taking questions from students at the end, not at the very end, but after we have a little bit more discussion. And Georgetown students in the Zoom room, if you want to submit a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And please remember to share your name and what you're studying, as well as your question. So Steve, if I may, let me start with you and ask a question. At the McCourt School, we actually emphasize the importance of evidence-based decision-making. Through efforts like the Massive Data Institute, we recognize the powerful role that data plays in shaping research and policy conversations. While there's a lot of public data that exists, they're not always easy to find, as you highlighted in your comments. They're not always accessible. So the data that USAFact provides is a huge public service. I guess my first initial question is, as you undertook this process, what did you learn about what government collects, and what did you discover that you didn't know before that motivated the way you've designed USAFacts to move forward?
There we go. I think a few things are probably important. One, government does collect a lot of data, and we ought to be thankful for that. And particularly in a world where people talk about, alternate facts, fake news, I do have great trust in the statisticians and professionals in our government who collect data. That's good. Number two, I don't think the way we collect data is necessarily oriented to support decision makers in decisions they need to make. There is data we simply don't collect that if, as a person who thinks about solving problems from business, there's numbers I would want to see, and I would want to see updated much more regularly in order to make good decisions. So government needs to figure out how to connect those things, I think, better than happens today. Third thing I would say about that is government actually, ironically, doesn't think about itself as having to make itself comprehensible by citizens. Maybe the data, if you can find it, an academic can get at it, use it, manipulate it, but most citizens, and I'm a little more involved than most citizens, you need to collect that data, and I won't say market it, but you need to put it in a form. And if you go to most government websites, there's data there, but nobody tries to wrap it up. And I'm not saying pitch a story, just make it easy to understand. And so I took a look at all of that stuff and say, there's a role for government to improve. Heck, I sometimes think government should have to prepare a 10K about itself, not just require businesses to do it. Sorry, the last part of your question was about USAFacts, but it slipped out of my mind, Maria.
Oops, you addressed my question,
Okay.
Which is really kind of giving us a better understanding of what you were trying to achieve and what was the need that you were trying to meet, which I think is it's very salient for the work that we do, because getting at the right numbers, and I think Nora will share a little bit about this when she has a chance to speak up. But I think a lot of what we do at the McCourt School is try to help our students not only understand the numbers, but understand how to find the numbers that they need, and how to make the best policy decisions based on that information. So thanks so much, Steve. And I want to, before I invite Nora, I wanted to turn to Olivia and just give you an opportunity to get a little granular and dive into the report for a minute. We know that, in particular, that COVID-19 was an important focus for your work, and that the COVID-19 pandemic has had really a transformative impact on K-12 education. And in a lot of ways is likely to reshape education for quite a long time to come. What do the data tell us about the state of education in the United States?
Great. Yeah. I mean, like we've made clear in our reports at USAFacts, I think the COVID-19 pandemic has reached all parts of our country, from the way education is delivered to our defense systems to transportation. And I think the impact on education is unfortunately one that might continue to exacerbate some of the discrepancies and inequalities we saw beforehand. So one thing we mentioned in the report is that more kids are spending less time learning. When you disaggregate that, by race or income, you see it often is, students in minority households or students in lower income households who are spending the even less time learning than they were before the pandemic. And you also see people in terms of delaying their college plans. I think for some, that's something that shows up in our data, that, a lot of students who are planning to go to college in the fall either deferred their plans or just completely canceled their plans to go to college. And I think one thing we're really interested to track at USAFacts is how many of those students who deferred, especially students who are lower income, are actually going to make it back once this fall. We don't know that yet. But I think one of the things that the pandemic has showed us also in terms of education and everything is that government data can be better and it can be more responsive. I was, responding to what Steve said, like education is actually one of the worst areas of education of government data in terms of lags. Like on that slide, you saw the average grant aid data from 2016. And that is like the best the Department of Education has for us right now. But right now, some of these statistics we're getting are from the Census Household Pulse Survey, which is something that's been going out like once every 2 weeks. Like we are getting data from 2 weeks ago, which in like government terms is like lightning strikes, or in terms of COVID-19 health data, we're getting, case and death data from yesterday, aggregated across over 3,000 counties around the country. So I think one of the positive things I'm seeing is that this pandemic is showing us that if we collaborate more and work harder, we can have more up-to-date and more comprehensive data systems. I hope we see that for education as well.
Well, as an HHSer, I'm always pleased to hear a shout out for my colleagues who have pulled together some data on COVID-19. I think that really has been an extraordinary effort. There's a lot of ways to go, but I think we've begun to see how important having up-to-date data really is for kind of moving policy forward. So thanks for those comments. Before we kind of get into more of a conversation, I want to turn just to Nora for a minute. As we like to say, Nora literally wrote the book, as Fadal noted, about how education leaders can use data and evidence to make better decisions. So Nora, you're an expert on education policy, particularly the federal role in elementary and secondary education. And I'd like to ask you a particular question that kind of follows up on the comments that Olivia made. President Biden recently signed the American Rescue Plan Act, which provides a substantial amount of money to public schools to help with reopening and recovery. And that followed the CARES Act. And so as you think about those funds, as schools determine the key priorities and identify the most impactful and equitable ways to use federal funds, what role can education data play? And what are some of the key priorities that you've identified in your research?
Great. Well, I want to start by just highlighting that this question about what role data can play in identifying these places that will be impactful and equitable for investing is actually surprisingly not the typical question that people are asking. Lots of people are interested in the question of what research says to do. And this is making me think about what Steve just said about, but what if you like to see a number and you don't know everything that happened and you can find research to say many things. So I'm a researcher. I do think research has something to say about what are effective uses of funds, but using data really can help leaders figure out which problems to prioritize and learn more about which solutions are going to work best in a given context. I think part of the challenge within education and getting people to think about data use is because different people have very different ideas of what the word data even means. As researchers, we have one idea of data. We're really thinking it's information, and it's information that's systematically collected and coded, and we know it means the same thing for different places. We've just seen lots of examples in this presentation of the breadth of the kind of systematic information that can be collected to describe education. And you can look in the report in the state of education in numbers to see there's enrollment rates, funding levels, graduation rates, who has computer and internet access, college tuition, how much debt people are accumulating. But lots of people who work in education think data means test scores, because the data that they're always being showed or held accountable for are test scores. And I think as schools are thinking about using data to help guide spending decisions in this moment, which is really right now, this is the moment, this is new money, $123 billion. Schools are trying to decide, in the next 60 days, how to spend it. I think using data is a really critical first step in figuring out what's going to be likely to help. And as school leaders or district leaders, they're sitting on a lot of data. So it's a different situation than the average citizen. But if you see an outcome like low reading proficiency rates, and you see that starting in third grade, a lot of people will think the problem is third grade reading test scores. Really, that's an outcome, and it's indicating a problem with some policy or how you're allocating resources. And so to think about how to improve things, you need to look at those data that tell you about what are your practices, how are you allocating your resources, time, money, class placements, staff, all of these things. So I think this will really be helpful for leaders who are thinking about how to make that kind of meaningful change and make the most out of this federal money. But it is sometimes a challenge to find these data first. And even within a school district, it can be hard because you can have, different, what we would think of as different types of variables residing in different data systems. So you have your HR system and you have your assessment system, and how are you going to make them talk to each other? So districts have made a lot of progress on this front, but it continues to be challenging. And I actually want to give a shout out to two groups at the McCourt School, the Economics Lab and the Massive Data Institute, that have been working on a very cool new data source that can help local leaders, advocates, citizens think about these types of resource allocation questions. The Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the most recent reauthorization of the big federal act that includes Title I and other funding sources, mandated that states need to collect school level spending data. So at the school building level, which has not been the case. And now these data are there, the states are collecting them, but they can be hard for the public to access. And so what the Economics Lab and the Massive Data Institute are putting up is easily accessible formats so that parents, school boards, educators, students can use these data to see how school districts are dividing up funds to individual schools. And I think it's really the same idea as with USAFacts, thinking that data matter when people can access them and therefore ask questions based on them and hold policymakers accountable.
Take, for example, what Nora just said. We can get building level spending. Is that really sufficient? We know that more experienced teachers get paid more than less experienced teachers. We might know what's being spent in the building, but is it class size then that's the issue, or you have less experienced teachers who make less money? So if I'm a decision maker, I need just a little bit more, and Congress is always going to struggle. The other thing which Nora highlighted, which I'll just jump on, is we need standards for how people report data. I will bet highly likely that districts don't even report similar things in exactly the same way. I know states don't. I know in criminal justice, I know some of the problems. What's a violent crime, for example, isn't the same thing in every jurisdiction. So getting the common data, having it at a level of depth, school building is so much better. And yet it opens so many more questions for decision making. Go ahead, Nora, you were going to say something, I think.
No, I think that's exactly the point, is that these data, not that they're the end all the be all, but now people will then start asking and think, oh, is this about a staffing ratio? Is this about seniority? What's going on? Is this because special programs reside in certain schools and not others? And really, trying to push for transparent and consistent resource allocation methods in school districts, rather than thinking that the squeaky wheel is going to get the grease there. And now I already forgot your second point that was also really good. And I went, about the consistent reporting. That actually, it's a big challenge in education data. And I think with these school level spending data, I'm actually quite excited by the work that Marguerite Rosa and her group at the Economics Lab has been doing, because they've been working with states since the law was passed, so for several years, on trying to get some consistent reporting standards. And not all states are participating in that, but there are going to be a lot of states where I think we will actually know what it means when they report things.
And I just want to say, I think more generally, this idea that we can pull together, even if it's not perfect yet, that we can pull together meaningful information so that we can have a shared set of facts, a shared set of information that we can discuss how to best move forward. I think that in a lot of ways, Steve, from what you said, that's kind of part of the founding logic of your effort. I think that's definitely part of the founding logic of the McCourt School. So we have people who have different opinions about things. It's nice. I have a good friend, and who has a somewhat different political background than I do. And she likes to say that we both agree that 2 + 2 is 4. She usually thinks 4 is too much. I usually think 4 is not enough, but at least we should both agree that 2 + 2 is 4, and are having some shared information so that we can spend less time arguing about what the reality is and a little more time about arguing about how we can move things forward, I think is really important and is part of what's admirable about your effort and the work of Edunomics and the kind of work and analysis that Nora and other colleagues do.
It's funny, Maria, because I absolutely understand the positive view that you and your friend bring together about looking at the common things. My initial reaction was also, is 4 too big or is 4 too small? Well, should we make it per capita to take a look at that? Well, what percentage of the total is that? Well, what outcome do we get from that? These are important to have enough of those, and I know you know this, of those contextual facts, as opposed to me saying, 700 billion is too much on education or it's too little. How much is it per student? What's the class size? Do we think 700 billion is a large spend compared to 6 trillion? So I totally relate to what you're saying. And unfortunately, a lot of it begs more data. The thing we have to all avoid if we're talking to citizens is how do we keep the discussion at a high enough level to be comprehensible? Now, you're academics. You guys could go a lot deeper than I can, but a high enough level to understand so that just as voters, we're not just pulling the lever that says, well, I'm generally an R, I'll pull the R level. I'm generally a D, I'll pull the D lever. Be able to assess the issues ourselves. I think that's important.
Absolutely agree. So I'm going to turn to questions, even though I had planned on asking additional questions of the panelists, but I want to give students an opportunity to participate. And the first question for tonight comes from Fadal, who introduced tonight's panel, and I will turn to him and let him ask the question himself.
All right, thank you, Dean. Thank you all again for coming. I guess I'm curious about this. So a lot of the dialogue right now around the limits of standardized testing data really talks about sort of what parts of the story are we missing. I'd be curious to know from you all, folks who have really dived into like sort of the quantitative data around education, what metrics do you feel like we're missing, right? Especially in terms of outcomes. I think, you often see schools like try to tout what their like college acceptance rates are, but their college retention rates might be very different, right? And we don't have those numbers. So I'm curious to know, like, in you guys' opinion, what metrics would it be very helpful for us as policymakers to have that we don't currently, or that we may not have a ton of?
Thanks, Fadal. Steve,
Nora, do you want to go? Do you want me to go? How do you want to do it?
Up to you. I can start briefly. It's a great question, Fadal. Thank you. One thing that there's many things. One thing that comes to mind right away is thinking about some mental health outcomes. That's just kind of a 2021 kind of thing on my mind for students. But I mean, predating the pandemic as well, there's a lot of interest in socio-emotional learning and how schools can support that, realizing that many outcomes, even these efforts to kind of link data to much longer run outcomes like labor market outcomes. And then, we always see a lot of criminal justice outcomes like in these Head Start types of studies. where you see long-term outcomes that aren't closely predicted by short-run test score outcomes. And so thinking, how did we affect these things in the long run when we didn't see that in test scores even a few years out? And I think there's a lot of interest in investing in socio-emotional learning, but we have a lot further to go in terms of measuring the impacts of those different programs.
Steve?
Yeah, I just add, I'm a big believer in standardized test scores. That doesn't mean the tests can't get better. They they should improve as it relates to serving well people from various race, ethnicity. They can do a better job, but they can't be, because if you don't have test scores, you have nothing. The education system isn't totally in charge. The teachers, the building of a kid's life. There'll be things that get worked in inside and outside. But a test score represents not just what you've learned, but in a way how functional your life has been. Because there's plenty of smart kids who have enough dysfunction and trauma in their lives that are affecting their study patterns. But if you have no diagnostic tool, you have a problem. Now, the thing I don't believe in is trying to compare test scores across schools too righteously. Unless you can get schools that really compare well, apples and apples, by poverty level, by race, by ethnicity, you can look at how schools improve. But if you don't compare well, you're just going to say, well, that school is a lot better than that school. Well, that school's in a rich neighborhood, and that school's in a poor neighborhood, or that school's in a place where there's a lot of English language learners. So I think it is important to look at the rate of improvement oftentimes amongst a peer set as opposed to looking at the absolute number. Well, the absolute number in terms of how easy is it going to be for you to get jobs when you're adult, the absolute numbers actually do matter. I believe that. I'm not an educator, but I think it's important to be able to read at certain levels and do math at certain levels.
Thank you both for those responses, and thank you, Fadal, for that question. The second question this evening comes from Harshini, who's a student in McCourt School's MS DSPP, Data Science and Public Policy program. And he asks, how did access to internet impact education in America as all the schools turned to digital learning as a result of the pandemic?
Olivia, Nora, do you want to go?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's been a challenging thing, like I said before, about sort of exacerbating some of the inequalities that already existed within the system. So I think in our data, you can see both. There's like, the yearly data we get from the census, where they ask people in households, do you have access to internet or computer? And actually, this new Census Household Pulse Survey is also asking about this. In both data sets, you do see that lower income students and students of color are more likely to not have regular, easy access to both internet and computer. One thing we found interesting in this is that there's a lot of talk about internet and like increasing broadband, like Steve mentioned, rural broadband. But one thing we see interesting in the data is that access to a reliable functioning computer for learning is like just as important, if not more of a problem. So that's another case where data is like, well, okay, should we pull our energy just into this broadband thing? Like, no, broadband's not great if you're trying to type your essay on your phone. You know what I mean? So I think the data has helped show us that the issue is in both places, and both will need to be addressed to address the inequities I'm sure going to be exacerbated by this crisis.
Thanks, Olivia. Steve and Nora?
Just one other quick thing, which is, if you look back and you relate even this issue, for example, to test scores are actually helpful for guiding money to kids in need. Places where the test scores are lower should drive this investment in computer access, as an example, as opposed to trying to generally putty out whatever money gets peanut butter it out, just smooth it out. I think this is a big issue, and this is a place where if we're going to put more money in, I would put it into communities where we're not seeing the kind of scores, et cetera, that we want.
I would follow up that, that's what federal accountability policy and many state accountability policies are sort of trying to get at, that general idea, but it's so hard to write a rule that is going to apply in this consistent way to get at exactly what you just said, thinking we want to target resources to the places that need it most. And then you have this tension in that you don't want to be incentivizing any poor outcomes. But and so then what you wind up with are these different categories of schools about, what level of improvement do they need based on, kind of failure to progress on various metrics. But it becomes interpreted differently in different states, and it kind of necessarily has to be a bit arbitrary in the sense of, okay, you're in this category where you get extra stuff.
All good points. So I really am anxious to hear the panelists' answer to our third question, which comes from Alex, who is an MBA student at Georgetown's McDonough School of Business and also a former K-12 teacher. He asks, should students enter business, government, or the nonprofit sector if they want to change the world and solve issues such as education and economic mobility, and why?
I'm happy to go first on that. As somebody who focuses on economic mobility, went to business school, and values a variety of skills. And I think that probably is the most important thing to say is different skills can make impacts in different ways. I'm going to point to some that are maybe common. First, just let me point to business. If people ask me, what will be the best thing you ever did in terms of contributing to society, it won't be anything we do in philanthropy or with USAFacts. I was part of the creation of the PC. That is a business contribution that I think has generally uplifted society. So should you go into business? There are plenty of opportunities to positively change the world. If you want to go into environmental energy businesses, there's plenty of ways to change the world. If you go to school in public policy and go to work in government, there are plenty of good ways to change the world. Now, I think you need a certain kind of analytic skill that is almost exactly the same as you need for business. You can draw judgments around it, but when we talk about, okay, what schools need support, how would you allocate resources, where do you move them around? Those issues don't sound a whole lot different to me than the issues businesses face. Businesses they have things that are less squishy than test scores. Test scores are better than a lot of government things. They have sales and revenue and profit against which to measure. But the analytical process, I think you can pick up in a variety of different places. And I think those skills would serve you well in a variety of different ways. In education, look, it's a linchpin area. And yet, I think, Nora, you said this earlier, and I happen to agree with it. Unless we take a look at whole child while we're in K through 12 and the social and emotional learning problems, the trauma issues, again, everybody can, you can look at the research, you can look at the numbers, people can decide. But people who've lived in education have better lived experience on what kids are going through. So I think there's a variety of, I think it was Alex, there are a variety of different ways to come at it. I was counseling a young man who's interning. Olivia actually was a student and a teaching assistant for a class I teach on this stuff with an economist at Stanford. And one of the other students who was in our class is interning in our philanthropy, and he's trying to decide where to go next after his year of fellowship with us. And he's sort of thinking about business, and he's sort of thinking about philanthropy. And I said to him, look, have you ever even thought about perhaps commercial banking with a focus on serving underserved neighborhoods? It's a huge issue. So there's ways to do good, a variety of ways from any one of those seats, I would argue.
That's a great answer, Stephen. I know we only have one more minute, and I know that Nora has a great reputation for giving wonderful advice. So I'm going to give her the last word, but a short last word.
Okay, well, thank you, Dean Maria, and thanks to all of you if it's really the last word. And thanks to all of our students. I see many of my students, including many students who are about to graduate. So this advice is for all of you. Do whatever you like. You can make an impact in all of these ways, and you can make more of an impact if you are happy, and you can keep doing it. But I will say, if you are thinking about public service, don't forget your state and local governments. And we're in DC, and that's great. We're excited to be here, but especially in K-12 education, those are great places to serve.
Well, thank you. That's a wonderful place to end, Nora. And I'm so pleased to have had Olivia and Steve and you here for this conversation. And I've got to say, I got to see a whole bunch of the other questions that were in the chat. And I'm just sorry that we didn't get to all of them, because they were great questions and they just are a sign of how important this conversation is and how much more work we have to do. So thanks to everybody for joining us today.
Thanks all.